It's Adam here for PC Monitors, and in this video I'm going to be taking a look at the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Acer XB323U GP. The OSD controls are found at the rear of the monitor, along the right side, running down. There are 4 pressable buttons, as well as a joystick. The top button is the power button. The second button down, or if you press any of the other buttons for that matter, before you've entered the main menu system, you get this little quick menu, and you'll see at the top it says modes, then it has brightness, then it has input. The first 2 buttons there are actually hotkeys, and you can configure them in the OSD, and I'll show you that shortly. But by default, the top one is modes, so you can select a preset mode for the monitor. And with this model, if you select one of these presets, except for HDR, I'll come on to that one shortly. So the G1, G2 and G3, action, racing and sports, they're fully customizable. You can save settings to those presets, whereas with the other presets, they just set things to predefined values. And if you make any adjustments in these presets, so let's say I go on racing, I then want to adjust the brightness, you'll see it switches over to mode user. I can then save this with save settings to there. And that allows me to save these settings to action, racing or sports, so my G1, G2 or G3 presets. I use racing G2 as my test settings, which I use for most of the review, and sports is my low blue light setting, so basically my test settings in terms of brightness and a few other things, but with a blue light filter applied, and I'll show you the low blue light settings shortly and go through that. Standard's just the factory defaults. Eco is just very dim or quite dim by default. Graphics very bright by default. The HDR setting is different. This is only designed to be used when you're actually running the monitor in HDR. You can use it otherwise, but really it just sets things to a high brightness and by default has a sharpness filter applied, which you can adjust. It's called super sharpness, and I'll show you this shortly in the OSD. But the point in this HDR mode is you're supposed to use it with an HDR color signal. So I'm just going to switch the monitor over to HDR now. You'll now see that brightness is grayed out. Various other settings are grayed out. Basically, the monitor takes control of things under HDR. So a lot of what I'm going to go through in this menu, it doesn't apply when you're running HDR. Just be aware of that. You can set this super sharpness setting, which is what I've just referred to then. That's just a sharpness filter. Some users will like it, some won't. I don't like it. I prefer the natural look without it on, but it is applied by default under HDR, so just be aware of that. If things look overly sharp, that's probably the reason why. Just disable the super sharpness. 2 different HDR settings, and I go through these in the review. There's auto, and there's HDR 600. The main difference here being that HDR 600 employs local dimming, and again, this is all explored in the review. Be aware that you can't use local dimming outside of HDR on this model. There isn't a setting to use it under SDR. It only applies when you're actually running under HDR. So even if you've got HDR 600 selected, as I do now, and you take off the HDR color signal, so I'm running an SDR again, it doesn't use any local dimming. It does need an HDR signal as well. So the second function there, brightness, and again these are hotkeys, the first 2, so you can customize these. So just an easy way to adjust the brightness. Input, easy way to select the input used by the monitor, and you can have it so it has auto source select, which means it will automatically select the input for you. You can turn that off if you prefer to manually select it and definitely know what you're using. So then there's the main menu, and I should also note that if you twiddle the joystick left, right, up or down before you've actually entered this little quick menu, it doesn't do anything, so there aren't any functions assigned to that, just so you're aware. So to go on the menu, you then have to press the joystick in again. You can see first up there's picture, so you can adjust the brightness and contrast. Blue light, so this is what I was referring to earlier with the blue light settings. So 50% is the strongest, 60% is a bit weaker, 70 weaker again, 80 weaker again. You'll see that one thing they do with ever strengthening effect is they decrease the default brightness, but you can always adjust the brightness yourself. So for the strongest blue light reduction, you would actually decrease the brightness as much as you're comfortable doing. That will decrease overall light output, including blue light output from the monitor. But the idea of the low blue light setting in general, as I said, I use this with my sports, my G3 preset. So the idea of this is to reduce the blue light output from the monitor, and it does so significantly. This is a very effective setting, especially at 50%. And it gives a warmer look to the image, a warm and green look to the image. Your eyes do adjust to this to some extent, but when you first activate it, the image certainly does look rather weird. But it's really designed to enhance viewing comfort, and it's something which is particularly useful in the evenings, where you should avoid stimulating blue light so that you get a good night's sleep if you can. Also note at this point, if you can see some weird little dancing lines on the screen, like you can there, I can see it on the camera's preview screen. That's not from the monitor, so don't worry about that. It's just more away from the camera, and it does occur when cameras are fairly close to monitors or at certain angles to monitors. So that's all that is. It's from the camera. Next, there's black boost. So I've got legom.nl, the website, open to try and help demonstrate this. Be aware that what you see on the screen is not representative of what you'll see by eye firsthand when you're using the monitor, but it can still help demonstrate this setting. So if you increase this, the default's 5, enhances the visibility of these dark shades. And unlike some settings, it's actually quite selective, so it doesn't increase your black point. Well, it might do a bit, but it doesn't significantly increase your black point. Certainly if you just increase this a bit, it really just targets those very dark shades other than black and raises them. It also has a gentler effect than some solutions of this sort on your brighter shades, so it doesn't really upset the image quite as much as what I'm trying to say, and it doesn't upset your contrast as much, but it still increases the visibility. I would say even with a setting of 10, it isn't really as extreme a boost as some settings of this sort. And you could combine this, or instead you could adjust the gamma setting of the monitor, lower the gamma to have a similar kind of effect, and you'll increase your visibility that way. So this isn't the only kind of setting you can use. But I would say that this is actually one of the better implementations of this sort of setting I've come across, because it doesn't completely upset the black point and it doesn't upset the image too much elsewhere. It does still have an effect, don't get me wrong, but it is more targeted than quite a few implementations of this sort I've seen. And if you decrease that, it starts dragging those dark shades down so they're even darker than they should be. Things can look quite cinematic. Next there's ACM, and that is, I believe it stands for Adaptive Contrast Management. It's essentially a dynamic contrast feature, and I explore that in the written review. HDR, which I've already gone through. And you'll see, because I've made various changes now, although I've changed them back to what I had before, it has switched over to user, and I have that save settings to thing there again. Super sharpness, which I've already gone through as well. Next there's color. That includes the gamma setting that I was referring to just before. You can set this to 1.8, 2.0, 2.2, 2.4 and 2.6. On my unit, these did correspond to the actual measured gamma values, the average gamma values. So mine was well tuned in this respect, but there aren't any guarantees with that necessarily. I'd like to think that most will be tuned in a similar way to mine, but just be aware that because it says gamma 2.2, 2.4, it doesn't mean that is exactly what it is. But it's certainly a means to increase or decrease gamma. There's color temp. You can set that to user if you want to manually configure the red, green and blue color channels, as I do for my test settings. There's also red bias, green bias and blue bias. So red gain, green gain and blue gain, or RGB gain, they're your standard color temperature controls. The bias settings are a bit different, and most monitors don't actually have these. They essentially adjust the red, green and blue components of the gamma curves of the monitor, and it's a very good way to upset the image if you make big adjustments here. There's no reason to actually adjust these, or no real reason to adjust these on this monitor, but some people do like to tweak things endlessly, and I totally get that. So if you want to tweak that kind of thing on this monitor, you can. But I wouldn't spend too long fiddling with these, trying to get the image a certain way. I would recommend just focusing on the red, green and blue gains instead. And to get out of user, this actually confused me a bit at first. I've even used Acer monitors with this kind of layout before, but it still caught me out on this one. When you're selecting the channel, so you do that by clicking the joystick in, that's the channel you're adjusting. If you press the joystick in again, it then stops highlighting that, but you'll see you're just cycling between red, green, blue gains and biases here. You then need to press back, so it means you press the joystick to the left, and that's how you can get back to the rest of the menu. In addition to user, there's warm, that's just the factory defaults, if I'm not mistaken. Normal, which on my unit is actually the same as warm, and perhaps it always is, so it's a little bit confusing why they would have normal and warm, or perhaps normal is the factory defaults. I'll just check because it will still be there in standard. So I can't always remember everything off the top of my head. So yes, the default's actually warm. There is normal. It's not exactly the same actually. It has a slightly cooler tint than warm does, but I wouldn't call warm by any stretch of the imagination. But anyway, that's what they've done. There's cool, which has a cooler tint, so it has a higher white point. And there are the blue light settings, which I went through before. So if you adjust the blue light in picture, it'll switch over to the blue light color temperature mode. There are some other settings here as well. Modes, which I've gone through. So this is another way you can access those preset modes. There's color space. These are quite interesting actually. The main ones to focus on are standard, which is the default one. There's also sRGB, and that's an sRGB emulation setting, which I explore in the review. And unlike some sRGB emulation settings, you can actually adjust the brightness. So that's a nice flexibility to have. And it does cut down on the color gamut. So it is an sRGB emulation setting rather than just a random setting on the monitor called sRGB, as some seem to have. And also note that if you're selecting a color space here, you lose access to the rest of this menu, the rest of the color menu. So it means you can't change the color channels and that kind of thing, unless you're on the standard setting. So you'll see the little up arrow appeared there. It means I can go up and change the color channels again. Rec. 709, which is a bit of an odd one because it basically makes the gamma higher. It makes things look quite deep and saturated for that reason, but it doesn't emulate the sRGB color space for the gamut of the monitor, which it should do because Rec. 709 uses that. So it's kind of more of a hybrid Rec. 709 mode. It just changes things to various different values. And the same with the remaining settings. HDR, that's just another way of activating HDR on the monitor. Again, you need to be feeding it an HDR color signal. That's the idea of this setting. So it is worth noting, if I didn't make it clear before, if the monitor receives an HDR color signal, it isn't like most monitors. They will usually automatically activate their HDR setting. With this one, you give it an HDR signal, you then have to go into the menu and activate HDR as well, which, to be honest, is a bit of an inconvenience, but really only a minor one. You get quite used to having to do that. And you can also use display widget software if you want to do it a bit more quickly without going into the menu. And then another slight annoyance is that it goes to the auto setting, even if you were using the display 600 setting or whatever it is they call it on this monitor. So the full VESA Display HDR 600 mode, it'll go back to normal, and you then have to go into the menu and change it to HDR 600. So that is a bit of an inconvenience, to be honest, but it is, again, it's something I got used to quite quickly. EBU, which is European Broadcast Union, designed for that. I mean, I'm not familiar with that standard myself, so I'm not sure if what it's doing here is correct. To me, it just looks quite similar to the factory defaults with perhaps a few tweaks here and there. It doesn't seem to do anything with the color gamut. DCI here, again, just uses the native color gamut, so it's not true DCI at all. So it just modifies things in other ways, just by default, just changes various different things. SMPTE-C, another standard I have no idea about. And good old standard color space, which uses the full native gamut of the monitor. Grayscale mode, so this just makes things grayscale, if you want to do that. 6-axis hue adjustment, so red, green, blue, yellow, magenta, and cyan hue adjustments. So again, this is a way that you can tweak the image in various different ways if you so desire. It isn't something which most users will want to make use of or have to make use of, but if you do like to use hue controls for whatever reason, you can do so. There's also a reset option, which will just reset the hue controls to the factory defaults. 6-axis saturation, so the same with saturation. This is potentially a bit more useful, has a bit wider utility, I should say. So by default, because the color gamut is very generous, the saturation levels are very high. If you want accurate coverage of the sRGB color space without overextension, that's what the sRGB emulation mode is for. Of course, if you're profiling the monitor and you're using a color managed workflow, then you've got more options. But really, these saturation controls are just designed to tweak things according to your own preferences. If you increase things here, it pulls shades closer to the edge of the gamut without making the most saturated shades any more saturated. Therefore, you lose shade variety. If you want to decrease saturation levels, you can do so: red, green, blue, yellow, magenta, cyan. So you've got reasonable flexibility, but even so, what I would say is that it is very difficult to maintain good balance by reducing saturation in this way. And if you find it looks good to you, then by all means, feel free to use these controls. That's what they're there for. But for me personally, I find that some shades maintain very strong saturation. By the time I've made the adjustments to reduce the saturation of those shades, other shades have then become clearly undersaturated, even with this 6-axis control. So just be aware that it isn't as easy as you might think to make these adjustments. But again, feel free to tweak if that's what you like to do. And reset, which will just reset these to the factory defaults. Next is audio. So you can change the volume or mute the integrated speakers or anything connected to the 3.5mm headphone jack. What I would say is that the speakers on this monitor, I do talk about them a little bit in the written review. They're really not very good. You can use them if you really need to, but I think most people would probably want to avoid using them where possible. I certainly do. So they're not really the best monitor speakers. Actually, some of the poorer ones I've come across, which is a bit of a shame. Quite a large monitor. Sometimes large monitors have quite nice, powerful speakers. Gaming, which allows you to set various things such as the overdrive setting, the pixel overdrive. You can only adjust that if adaptive sync is disabled. You can enable and disable adaptive sync. I mean, that's fairly self-explanatory. But in case you're not aware, adaptive sync is the protocol that monitors use to allow you to use AMD FreeSync on compatible GPUs. And nowadays also NVIDIA's G-Sync compatible mode on compatible GPUs. So you can enable or disable that. And then if that's disabled, you can access overdrive. And this is explored in the written review, off, normal, and extreme. It doesn't matter what you set this to. If you're going to enable adaptive sync, it'll default to normal, or a setting which is similar to normal, I should say. There's refresh rate num, so that will put the refresh rate on the screen. At the top right, you can see it there in yellow. And this will change according to the frame rate if you're within the variable refresh rate range. So it acts as a frame rate counter if you've got adaptive sync active doing its thing and you're within the variable refresh rate window of operation. There's ultra low latency, and this is something which is only available to select, again, if you've got adaptive sync disabled. If you've got adaptive sync enabled, it just grays it out, it sets it to on, it has low latency, and I do actually record that in the written review, so it's not a problem. Don't worry about latency when you've got adaptive sync active. It's basically forced on. If for whatever reason you want to disable ultra low latency and you're not using adaptive sync, you can do that. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that. I didn't notice any negative implications to having this. As usual, it's just a sort of option there. It kind of looks nice, and then they can advertise this as a setting. Aim point. This allows you to select one of these beautiful crosshairs there, which will appear in the center of the screen. So there's icon 1. You can see that there. It's just white. You can't customize the color or anything like that. And you can't adjust the position. It's always in the center of the screen. Or there's icon 2 or icon 3. I'll just show you icon 2. And icon 3. Next you've got OSD, so some settings pertaining to the OSD itself. Language that it's displayed in, various different options there. OSD timeout, so that's how long after the last button press before the OSD will automatically disappear in seconds. So you can set that between 10 and 120 seconds. If you want to manually exit the OSD, that's what the little X button there's for. Just disappears straight away. You can enable a transparency effect for the OSD or change the level of transparency, in fact. I'm quite happy with that being off. I'm not really too fussed either way, except I would be a bit fussed if it was set to 80% because things are a bit difficult to see. OSD lock, and I'm starting to sweat even thinking of this because I get a lot of people asking, how do I unlock this monitor once they've locked it in the OSD, or it's become locked and they don't know how to. The user guide of the monitor will often tell you how to do this, but I appreciate that Acer monitors, the user guides are not always very easy to find online, and not everyone keeps the written copy. So I'll just go through this. So once you've locked the OSD, you'll see that the power indicator, normally this would be blue when the monitor's on, but you'll see it's amber, and usually it's amber when the monitor's on standby, so it enters a low power state, signal to the system is lost, that kind of thing. So this is an indication that you've got OSD lock on. So if you press a button, other than the power button, it'll say OSD locked. And I haven't read the manual as to how you unlock this, but I'm going to just completely hazard a guess that you probably push the joystick in for a certain amount of time. There we are. So you just push the joystick in for, I think it was around 5 seconds, and then it unlocks the OSD. So if you're stuck with the OSD lock, that's how you get rid of it. System next, input. You can change the input used by the monitor. So DisplayPort, HDMI port 1, HDMI port 2. Auto source, again, have it selected for you automatically or manually select it if you prefer. DisplayPort format, so DP 1.4 for the full capabilities, or you can set that to DP 1.2 for compatibility purposes with older systems. Hotkey assignment, so that allows you to change those 2 top buttons before you've gone into the main menu, and by the top buttons I'm not including the power button there, you can't change what that does. But there's modes and brightness, or you can change that to volume, gamma, contrast, blue light, overdrive, PIP, P by P, and back to modes again. So you could change that to gamma and have this set to, I would set it, well, yeah, let's see what overdrive does, because I've got adaptive sync on. It shouldn't be selectable, but let's just see. Yeah, you can see that's grayed out, but gamma, you can select the gamma setting. Got nice little clear icons there as well, so you know what everything does. And of course it's written there as well, in case you didn't know what the little graphic is showing you there. So I can now quickly change the gamma setting if I want to do so. Next, this wide mode, and this is meant for when you're running the monitor in a non-native resolution. So I'm just going to switch this over to one of the resolutions in the first list on NVIDIA's control panel here, which will allow the monitor to use interpolation, and I'll be able to show you the wide mode setting and what it does. Otherwise, it's just going to be using GPU scaling, and this isn't applicable. So this is using the default full setting for wide mode, and that means all of the pixels of the monitor are used. An interpolation process is used to fill that out. I've got the full HD resolution running. Looks softer. This is all explored in the interpolation and upscaling section of the written review. The next setting is aspect, and this doesn't matter for this particular resolution because it's 16 by 9. This is actually the only sort of aspect ratio I would use on this monitor myself. But if you were to use a different aspect ratio with your resolution, this will pay attention to that, and it will make sure that it isn't distorting the image. It's not sort of stretching things out weirdly, but it will still be using interpolation. So you just get a bit of a black border so that it doesn't distort the image. There's then one-to-one pixel mapping, and you can see that gives a nice black border around the image, but it's only using 1920 by 1080 pixels in the center of the screen. The rest of the pixels are unused, so to speak. They're in the black border. So this gives you a completely undistorted image in the center of the screen, but it doesn't use the full screen space. Next up, you've got PIP, PBP, picture-in-picture, picture-by-picture. As usual, I've only got one source connected, so this isn't going to be a particularly interesting demonstration. But if you enable that, you can have it set to PIP large, which will give you your subsource in that box there and your main source for the rest of the screen. So of course, if I had something connected with HDMI, I could see that in that box there. You can change the position of that box. You can change it so it is small rather than large. You can change the size, so I'm assuming that's the scaling setting. That's grayed out for me because I'm assuming because I haven't got anything connected to it, but it's set to aspect now, and I'm guessing there would be a full setting, perhaps one-to-one. I'm not so sure about that, but probably a full setting there. You can select the subsource, so which input is actually used for that subsource. You can swap the sources around as well, the subsource and the main source, and you can select whether the audio is coming from your main or your subsource. The other setting is PBP, picture by picture. So that just gives you side by side of your two sources. And there are a few settings related to this aspect. So it must be that aspect wasn't actually available at all when I was using PIP before. So sorry about my slightly erroneous explanation there. But you can set that to full or aspect. So if you set that to full, it's going to use the whole of the half of the screen, and of course, because of the resolution I'm using there, it's all stretched and weird, or because of the aspect ratio, I should say. Well, both go hand in hand, really. And again, you can change the subsource, you can swap the sources, and you can change the audio source used. Next, you've got DDC/CI, which allows you to use software to control the monitor, such as Acer Display Widget, which I'm going to show you very shortly. Won't take too long because it's fairly simple software. HDMI black level, set that to normal or low. So normal would be your full range RGB, low would be limited range RGB. Most users should just leave that set to normal. And I'm using DisplayPort now. This isn't applicable to DisplayPort anyway. Well, it certainly doesn't appear to be on this monitor. I know on some it might change the signal, but either way, that's there if you need to use the limited range RGB signal because of the system you're using. Some games consoles might prefer that, for example. Generally older games consoles, or the Nintendo Switch, I believe, is one of the ones which likes to use the limited range signal. I don't use the Switch myself, so I could be wrong there. Quick start mode. There's a splash screen which comes up when you turn the monitor on. If you want the monitor to start a little bit more quickly and not display that, then you can select quick start mode. So I'm just going to turn the monitor off and then on again. I think I might have timed this with the last Acer monitor I used, and I didn't make a massive amount of difference. It did make it start up a bit quicker, perhaps. I think on this one it does make it start up a bit quicker. So I'm just going to leave that off. I don't really care for the splash screen. But if you do like the splash screen, just have this set to off. Power off USB charge. So this means if the monitor enters a low power state, if you want to charge things that are connected by USB to the monitor, then you can still do so. That means you'd have to select on here. The downside of selecting on, it's really a very minor downside, but I do have to mention it anyway. It means that even if you're not using those USB ports, the standby power consumption is slightly increased of the monitor. I'm talking about a fraction of a watt here, so it's nothing to lose sleep over. But I would suggest that if you're not using the USB ports to charge things when the monitor enters a low power state, there's no point in having this set to on. You might as well just leave that set to off. The keen-eyed ones amongst you might have realised there's a little eye information section there as well. So if you press that, you can see a few little details about the monitor. You can see the main source used. So that's how you've got it connected, in other words. The resolution it's currently running at. So this can be useful if you want to work out if it's the monitor that's using its interpolation or the GPU scaling is taking over. So if you selected a non-native resolution and it still displays 2560 by 1440, that's because it's using GPU scaling. The monitor isn't doing anything there. Horizontal and vertical frequency, the V frequency is the important one there. If you've got adaptive sync active, that will be changing based on your frame rate. It tells you if adaptive sync is active, and it shows you your serial number as well. There's also an option here to reset all settings, which I do not want to do. As promised, I'll now show you Acer Display Widget software. You can find a link to download that in the description of this video. This is quite a lightweight little piece of software. It's quite simple, really. It's basically, the main function is a quick way to change the preset used by the monitor. And when I say quick, so as you can see, it does rapidly switch between these. The HDR setting takes longer because it is trying to now look for an HDR signal. Advanced settings will allow you to change various things. It doesn't allow you to change everything, so it's not a comprehensive replacement for the OSD, but you can see there are some things here like blue light, brightness, contrast, gamma, color temp. You can change the red, green and blue color channels, and you can see there it's just the gains, so the main ones. Black boost, volume, refresh rate num, you can have that on or off. The overdrive setting, and you'll recall that I am using adaptive sync, which incidentally you cannot enable or disable here in this menu, but I am using adaptive sync, so if I try to change overdrive to something else, it looks like I can. But actually when you go back to advanced settings and it loads these up, it does take just a little bit of time to actually see what these settings are all set to. You'll see that set back to normal again. Next is Game View Sync, and the idea here is that you can have different presets assigned to different applications. So you can add apps here. You can select apps that are running in the background already or you've got open, or you can select the exe file manually. So I've just got Origin listed here, and if I want, I can have the monitor automatically switch to a different mode when I'm using Origin. For example, let's say I wanted to use my sports mode when I'm using Origin. So if I now open Origin, nothing happens. As Origin is updating itself, as it always does, every single time you want to use it. But you'll see there, it's now switched to the sports setting. And if you see, actually, as soon as I went on to something on my desktop instead, it went back to the standard settings. But if I quit Origin, it'll certainly just be using the settings I was using before. So that's basically how that works. Hopefully that makes sense. Split screen. So this allows you to arrange windows in various different ways on the screen. So if you wanted them to be arranged like that, what happens is you select one of these and then you have to slide the windows into place. You'll see that the screen shows you where the different sections that you've selected are. What I would say is this isn't as neat as some. You'll see there's actually a gap between them. That's a little bit strange, so I would manually resize them. You'll see that it's not actually filling the screen completely. I don't know if that's because I'm using Chrome and perhaps it sometimes does this anyway, but you can then select different arrangements. You'll see that it doesn't automatically snap the windows into different positions when you select other ones here. By the way, I'm not sure what this G thing means. If anyone knows in the comments, please enlighten me. And this one as well, I'm not sure what that does. Okay, and I don't know how to get rid of this preview either anymore. I think I've completely lost the plot now. Not very intuitive, Acer. Not very intuitive at all. I can't seem to actually use anything on Display Widget or my system now, so that is not useful. Maybe I will just exit Display Widget. That did the trick. Then I'll open it up again. So you see, I like to show these instead of editing them out of the video. These sort of issues I have, so if people have the same issue themselves, they don't feel completely stupid or anything. It happens to the best of us, you see. So as I was saying, it doesn't automatically snap your windows into place. This is what I want to use now. I'll have to manually put the windows there myself. So not the most intuitive, and as you'll see again, there's that gap there. I don't know why it does that, and there's also a gap there. So to be honest, not the best functionality of this sort that I've come across. And that's really the end of the Acer Display Widget. There's nothing more you can do with it. So really the main thing I'd use it for is switching presets. If you want to do that, quickly switch presets, change some of the simple settings without having to click around in the OSD, or use the Game View Sync feature if you like to use different modes for different applications. There's also settings here, and this doesn't give you anything particularly useful. So you can turn the power on or off. Power indicator, this monitor doesn't allow you to turn that off, so that's grayed out. Power key lock, again, it's not relevant on this monitor. Key lock is relevant, so you can do that. And I've already explained how you get rid of that, but you can actually just get rid of it with Display Widget as well. Run at startup or always on top, pretty self-explanatory, and you can check for updates or reset everything to the factory defaults. So that's all there is to Acer Display Widget, and all there is to the OSD on-screen display menu system of the Acer XB323U GP. Be sure to check out the full review on pcmonitors.info. There's a link to that in the description of the video, alongside information about how you can support the work that we do.